I'm Gina Sapiro. I'm the Dean of CAS, and I'm really pleased to welcome you here tonight for our Discoveries Lecture. The Discoveries Lecture was a series that we invented a few years ago to reinforce the idea, especially that once you've been a BU student, you never stop learning from this place. And it's one of the things we've been trying to do, is to expand the number of opportunities for people to come back, to engage with the campus, to continue to learn and grow and expand throughout your lives. So we're very grateful for you for coming and for our faculty for participating and joining us here. We are going to complete the year with one more Discoveries lecture after this. The title of it will be We Are What We Eat, Issues of Food Supply. That lecture will be on Thursday, April 28th. You will all get notices of that. It will feature Professor Nathan Phillips of the Department of Geography and Environment. And he's terrific. I recommend it highly. He's one of our great young faculty, and it should be a super evening. We're really doing some great developments now in the area of environment and environmental science. An increasing number of people in CAS and in the other schools that are looking at food and food issues, so it should be a really good evening. Just because the school year ends, this next lecture will be in April, but just because the school year ends doesn't mean we have to stop having our programs and stop learning. This year, for the first time, we are actually having summer school for alumni. Programs like these inviting people to come back and continue to learn. So I am really pleased to introduce a new initiative we have, Alumni College, which is intended to be a dynamic, immersive educational opportunity, not just a lecture, but 2 or 3 days, to come here and really spend some time soaking in a really interesting topic, reigniting your inquisitive senses here at BU. The topic for this year's Alumni College is sustainability in the city, and it's going to take place over the weekend of June 10th to 12th this summer. The weekend will feature faculty experts from the College of Arts and Sciences, Department of Geography and Environment, and others. Professor Phillips, who's doing this April lecture, will be the perfect introduction to the curriculum. It's going to involve some classroom work and lectures, no tests, I can tell you, no midterms, no papers. But some classroom work, some exploratory work, some field trips around Boston, really an opportunity to explore the questions of the sustainable city using our, hopefully, sustainable city as the laboratory to continue to learn about this. So you'll all be getting materials on this. I think there's some information out front, and I hope that some of you participate. In future years, we'll pick different topics each year, and so if environment and sustainability is not your thing, I promise you over the next couple of years we'll find a topic that you do want to spend 2 or 3 days just diving in and soaking with some other people. So with that, I'm very pleased to introduce our speaker for this evening and the topic, Jeff Henderson, who's Professor of Greek Language and Literature and Director of Graduate Studies in the Department of Classical Studies, and most importantly for me, my predecessor as Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences, left it in good shape. Thank you very much, Jeff. The topic for tonight, as you can see, is something we really need. As a political scientist, I think there's actually a lot of political humor out there, but I'm hoping Jeff is going to talk about political humor that will make us laugh rather than cry. Before coming to Boston University, Jeff held professorships at Yale University, the University of Michigan, the University of Southern California. He's known for his pioneering work on Greek drama and politics, and for his editions and translations of the comic playwright Aristophanes, who I suspect will be involved tonight in some way. He's held fellowships from the National Endowment for the Humanities, the American Council of Learned Societies, and the Simon Guggenheim Foundation. And he's the president-elect of the American Philological Association, the principal professional organization of classicists in North America. Since 1998, he's been the general editor of the Lieb Classical Library, published by Harvard University Press, and the world's premier series of texts and translations of Greek and Latin authors. He's a great speaker and pretty funny himself, Jeff.
shape. I'm not sure if I could say the other way around. But it was quite a nice experience. And one of the great experiences of being a dean is meeting alumni and working with them. And I met quite a few wonderful alumni that I wouldn't have met otherwise, and made some friends. And I'd like to thank the organizers of the Discovery Series for inviting me tonight. I look forward to the reception. I hope that you all can stay around. I'll speak for under an hour, and then we'll have 15 minutes or so of questions if you have questions, and I hope you do. And then we can all enjoy the reception. Meanwhile, all that stands in the way of a pleasant reception is this talk. And so let's begin. In view of all of the talk nowadays about the polarization of our society, angry rants, online bullying, political nastiness generally, and how dangerous this might be for our democracy, I thought it would be interesting to take a look back at the world's first democracy in classical Athens of the 5th century BC and take the temperature of its political discourse. Has our society declined from some golden age of civility, or have we seen all this before? I thought that a productive way of approaching this question would be to talk about political humor as a feature of the Athenian democracy in the days of the comic poet Aristophanes, when democracy in the world was only a generation or two old. Here, comedy is a valuable source both for the humor and the politics. For when we talk about political civility and political abuse, one of the things we talk about is what outlets a society has for expressing strong differences, even ridicule, and how are these outlets managed? What structures are there? Are they organic to a democratic system? Are they time out of time? Exactly how does a society allow and manage expression of very strong opinion and dispute? In classical Athens, the main outlets were two: actual political oratory and political comedies produced at the national theatrical festivals. Aside from comedy and political oratory itself, Athenian art and literature in Aristophanes' time seem to have avoided depicting contemporary personalities and events at all. In tragedy, satyr drama, dithyramb, or other kinds of poetry that was produced for national enjoyment and at great national cost, as also in painting, sculpture, architecture, and public monuments. Even the recent past, let alone the political present, was cast in heroic or mythic terms. And it was actually an actionable offense to have any political content intrude into public monumentalizing of the democracy or the Athenian character. So it was all up to politicians and comedians to fill the blank. For most people, theatrical comedy was their only chance to speak to and laugh at power and at themselves. So let me begin on familiar ground with some recent examples. Not so current, because at the moment, partisan rancor in the country has become so extreme that humor, with its palliative powers, seems more partisan and therefore less and less welcome anywhere along the political spectrum. A while ago, however, our presidential campaign, despite being unusually long, intense, and nasty, did not entirely lack the element of humor, which, as always, provided a safety valve for aggression, frustration, and self-righteousness that might otherwise have exploded, as indeed these elements in our discourse now threaten to do, if the recent shootings in Arizona are any indication. Since politics is a contact sport, political humor is always aggressive, but if successful, disarming rather than abusive, scoring a point more memorably than a simple accusation, and diffusing or sidestepping a complex issue rather than letting it fester. Best of all, good humor is hard to quarrel with, much less refute. The butt just has to take it, like Governor Palin versus Tina Fey, or The butt may respond in kind if he or she has the wit, even in a self-deprecating and therefore ingratiating way. When asked about his eighth cousin relationship with Dick Cheney, candidate Obama said, "I don't want to be invited to the family hunting party." Mike Huckabee said, "I'm from Hope, Arkansas. You may have heard of it. All I'm asking is give us one more chance." But while humor can be more effective than straight statements, it's also riskier. What's funny is always up to the audience to decide. So there's an inherent risk that it will be taken the wrong way. Candidate McCain was trying to be funny when he replied to a young voter who'd asked if he's too old to be president, "Thanks for the question, you little jerk." To many, this came off as more mean and defensive than funny, although some people did think it was funny. My brother, for instance. Just as some took or pretended to take Obama's use of the humorous phrase, "lipstick on a pig," more literally than intended, as referring to Sarah Palin. Do you remember this one? In addition to being a weapon for politicians and their partisans, political humor is also a resource for professional humorists, mainly cartoonists and comedians. Let's call this the third-party dimension. Since these humorists are not themselves political competitors, and at least officially unpartisan, they are free to address issues and anxieties that politicians do not, cannot, or prefer not to raise themselves. Thus, they serve not only as a safety valve and BS detector for the electorate, but also as its voice, crystallizing community views and opinion that would otherwise have no communal outlet, and ultimately affirming that the community may be more honest and savvy than the powers that be. In any community, there's an undercurrent of knowledge that people have, or opinion that people have, that isn't explicitly addressed by officialdom, but that's there all the same. And how does that get expressed in a way that everybody can focus on and say, yes, that's what we all think? Sometimes this merely amounts to taking the powers that be down a peg or two. In this cartoon, a hot partisan issue is deflected into general cynicism about politicians in general. Or a cartoonist might channel a more pointed charge. Politicians can't call their opponents crooked or criminal, even in jest, unless they are prepared to prove it on the stump or defend it in a libel suit. But cartoonists are free to express community suspicion, sometimes to the helpless detriment of the politician open to charges of crookedness, or even worse. This cartoon alludes to the Nuremberg Nazi trials, connecting dots that in official discourse would be too inflammatory, although more recently we have had some of these dots connected with some accompanying uproar. So it's a moving target, what you can get away with. This sort of humor is not an invention of our overwrought age, but has a long history. In the 1870s, cartoonist Thomas Nast relentlessly portrayed the Tammany Hall politician Boss Tweed as a crook and a predator. Tweed complained, "My constituents can't read, but damn it, they can see these pictures." Some of you will remember in the 50s and 60s, Richard Nixon complaining that Herb Bloch's caricatures of him as Tricky Dick helped cost him elections. I've always loved this cartoon. But just like politicians, professional humorists risk being misunderstood. The infamous New Yorker cover depicting Michelle and Barack Obama as Islamic terrorists was intended to be self-evidently amusing satire of a preposterous smear. But it was widely denounced, at least on the left, as propagating the smear instead of satirizing it. Because you don't really have the cues to where the smear is here, or that you're supposed to think that this is just a satire. The Vanity Fair takeoff on the McCains felt more like a partisan response than satire. In short, these cartoons failed as humorous comment by straying into the political contest itself. The intended satire lacked the necessary distancing. It lacked the third-party dimension. Wasserman took a more conventional tack in lampooning the Obama as radical theme, doing the humorous job of pointing to the underlying contradictions, or better, hypocrisies of political rhetoric. Since political humor is notably restrained or forbidden in authoritarian societies, where ruling elites allow little or no popular power or political competition, it's worth asking whether political humor is an organic element of democratic societies. And we may as well start with classical Athens, and with a focus on the world's two first democratic leaders, the eloquent and aristocratic statesman Pericles, and his successor. No pictures of him. The caricatures that we have, as you'll see in a while, are highly unflattering. And his successor, the plain talking businessman Cleon, who didn't come from a good family and made a fortune running a tannery and shoemaking factory. Then, as so often in modern democracies, Pericles and Cleon led a nation beset by war, economic crises, sharp cultural and religious clashes, howling from the rich about overtaxation, conflicts between social classes and generations, as well as international challenges to its status as an imperial power. But there were significant differences in the democratic system in which Pericles and Cleon operated. And these differences will help account for the differences in political humor that characterized their era. The main differences as regards political humor between authoritarian and democratic societies is that in the former, we sometimes find the competitive variety, but never the third-party dimension. This was the case in pre-democratic Greek. Homer's Iliad, the very first text in the Western tradition, opens with a debate between two kings, Agamemnon and Achilles, a debate full of bitter humor. But when the common soldier Thersites humorously editorializes about the debate, he is beaten by another king, Odysseus, for stepping out of line. For in authoritarian societies, political humor, when present at all, is reserved for equals among the ruling class. The people are not allowed to criticize, even in jest. In a democracy where there are no rulers, but only leaders that the people decide to empower, and might also decide to disempower, third-party humor appears among the people as a dimension of their decision-making, and a special one, because humor can facilitate the expression of knowledge or opinions inexpressible at the level of political competition. Or put another way, political humor can be a privileged extension of political debate. Our British-American tradition of political debate demands good sportsmanship, at least so far. Honesty, at least insofar as no one can prove dishonesty. And abusiveness only within the bounds of gentlemanliness, with an opponent's family and other innocent bystanders generally considered off limits. Nor do politicians criticize or ridicule the electorate. Perhaps surprisingly, given that in a democracy the people are in charge and in theory should not fear criticism or ridicule from politicians. These constraints can probably be attributed to the fact that modern democracies are representative, not direct. Candidates represent the parties or districts that chose them, but they must also represent the government as a whole, i.e. the political class, and they must try to expand their base by catering to potential voters so that they cannot be too divisive and must avoid the appearance of self-interest, frivolity, elitism, and superiority. And since individual reputations are protected by libel laws, personal attacks must be demonstrably true, or at least not actionably false. By contrast, democratic Athens had a direct rather than a representative democracy. The people decided all issues and all legal disputes by direct and unappealable vote. There was no standing government. All offices were filled by lot from the whole citizenry. and none lasted more than a year. No office lasted more than a year. Most offices lasted from 1 day to 30 days. If you were chosen, if your name was pulled out of the hat, then you were the president of the assembly for 1 day or 1 month, and so forth. There were no political parties, no professional politicians, and no elections except for military commanders. Political leaders were simply those who consistently rose in the assembly, which met daily, and offered successful proposals to the people. Once a year, there was a kind of negative election known as ostracism, in which every citizen was a candidate. The term derives from the word ostrakon, a shard of pottery used as a ballot. In the ostracism, the people could vote to expel any individual from Athens for 10 years, for any reason. Usually because someone was too politically disruptive or threatened to become too powerful, like Themistocles in this ostrakon. Themistocles, a great hero of the Persian Wars. This ostrakon actually comes from a group of several hundred that were found in a well in an unopened container, all written by the same person. Now, obviously, this was a ballot stuffing effort to Themistocles' enemies. But that's an ostrakon. You just scratch the name of Themistocles on it. A man might be ostracized simply because people disliked him. Again, for any reason. For example, Aristides the Just was reportedly ostracized because people got tired of hearing him called the Just. Whether that's true or not, that was a joke that later has, but the Greeks were happy at remembering him as one of the just people, but also laughed about having ostracized him. For all these reasons, the Athenian politician was much more an individual actor than today's politicians, and the competition tended to be much more personal and abusive, not only in attacking an opponent's qualifications and motives in offering proposals, but also his character and the character of his family, especially his wife and his mother, and his friends. Since the most important question about a politician was, can we trust this man's advice, a politician's character and reputation were fair game for opponents. Here's a sample of political invective in the Athenian assembly from the great orator and politician Demosthenes, attacking his longtime adversary, Aeschines, who in reality came from a prominent, though not the highest social background, and who had been a successful, though not a star, actor. Demosthenes addresses the jury, which was hundreds of Athenians who showed up to be the jury and were going to vote. I am in no quandary as to what I should say about you and your family, only as to what to mention first. Shall it be that your father, Mr. Fearful, was a slave who wore thick fetters and a wooden collar, and was on the staff of LPS, who ran an elementary school by the shrine of Theseus? Or that your mother performed afternoon weddings in the hut near Hero's, the bone seller's place, while she was rearing you, the fine, statuesque, supreme third-rate actor? And what about the galley piper Phormio, slave of Dion of Phrearioi, who rescued her from that honorable labor? No, by heaven, I'm afraid that if I describe you in plain words, I'll be thought to have chosen topics that are inappropriate for me. So I'll leave those topics aside and start with his own life, for he was born of no ordinary parents, but the sort that are cursed by the people. It is recently, well, not even recently, but just the other day, that he became a citizen and a politician. Then he changed the ending of his father's name, making it Fearless instead of Fearful, and his mother adopted the very imposing name of Fair Goddess, though everyone knows her by the name of Boogie Woman. Which, of course, she got by performing, permitting, and becoming all manner of things. For how else could she have got that name? And yet, you are so ungrateful and naturally evil that despite moving from slavery to freedom and from poverty to wealth by the grace of these citizens here, you not only give them no thanks, but act against their interests as a hired politician. I shall leave aside those cases where it is disputed whether he has spoken for the city's good, and concentrate on those in which he has clearly been shown to have acted on behalf of our enemies. And this goes on and on. This is just a little piece of this. Well, I dare say that today, this kind of invective would be considered not only shockingly negative, but also libelous, because save for the fact that Aeschines had been an actor, none of these charges was true. And most, if not all, members of the audience knew that they were not true. But they also knew that it was meant to be funny, a form of forensic entertainment called loidoria, or abuse. And this is a special kind of abuse. If you have an enemy, you are expected to use humor to exaggerate your enemies or your opponents' acknowledged weaknesses or failings, including personal life, family members, sexuality, economic status, vices like gluttony, physical features or mannerisms, military record, degree of patriotism, and so forth. But it was essential that this abuse be humorous, and too bad if a politician had no sense of humor, because he could not sue on the grounds that a false and/or malicious attack had harmed his reputation. Athenian libel law did not protect individual reputations, only an individual's eligibility to participate in political life. So the libel laws were set up to protect the city rather than the individual. So there were areas of humorous abuse that were off limits, even in jest, but only those that, if true, would disqualify someone from participation in civic life. Attacks against an office holder or a military commander, though these could be abused as a class, you didn't abuse any individual office holder. Because remember, these were people whose names had been chosen and who were doing their citizens' duty to hold this office, and often they had never held an office before, would never hold it again, and really didn't really know what they were doing, and they needed a lot of help. Also, military commanders did not want gripes to become official complaints, so these were off limits. Couldn't make jokes about that. You couldn't make charges of murder, abusing your parents, public debt, evasion of military duty, aspiration to tyranny, offenses against the gods, desertion in battle, inheritance squandering, self-prostitution, or foreign parentage. But you notice that Demosthenes just abused Aeschines for foreign parentage. You could make this charge if there was any grain of truth to it. And it's probable that Aeschines' great-great-grandmother or something had been an aristocrat from some other city. This system recognized and protected two fundamental democratic rights. Isagoria, the right to offer advice to the people, and parrhesia, the right to speak frankly. Humorous invective was a way of showing how you frankly felt about an opponent. The more passionate and the more colorful your insults, the more you believed this to be true, and that was taken into account. And if it made the audience laugh at your opponent, so much the better. If it exaggerated his weaknesses or even departed from the truth slightly, you had diminished his reputation in a way that couldn't be refuted, but only answered in kind. Really, the worst thing that a public figure can carry around is a good joke at his or her expense, that people will remember whenever they see this person, even if it's technically harmless. The protocols governing third-party political humor were much the same in Athens, except that then, as now, they were not restricted to the topics at hand in a forensic debate. There was no press, but there were entertainers, amateur and professional, who made political jokes, did impressions, sang humorous political songs at symposia, drinking parties, which were the main social venue for Athenians, that is, drinking parties. We call symposia now scholarly conferences and discourses and seminars, but it used to be drinking parties. There was also freelance cartooning. Here's one from the era of the Persian Wars. Against Callias, son of Cratias, here dubbed the Persian. Callias is caricatured as a full-dressed Persian with a bow and a funny hat, booties and pants. the implication that Callias was unpatriotic by association with a foreign enemy was pretty typical, and is of a piece with the New Yorker Obama cover and still current attempts to link Obama with these same Near Eastern foreigners. Since Athenian citizenship under the democracy had an ethnic requirement, which Pericles passed as a law, but then at the end of his life tried to get his own bastard son enrolled as a citizen as an exception to the law. You had to have both parents as Athenians. We find ethnic caricature also in contemporary vase painting. Greek versus Persian on the Eurymedon vase. I'm afraid that this Greek is threatening anal rape of this Persian who's bent over and seems to be inviting it. This is a sexual fantasy that the Athenians enjoyed when they were fighting the Persians, that the Persians were effeminate and the Greeks were masculine. So you would call this a patriotic cartoon. The Egyptians too. This is the He-Man hero Pericles cleaning up a bunch of maggoty-looking Egyptians with his club. So ethnic caricature. The Athenian democracy had an ideology of exceptionalism, that they were exceptional as a race. They'd always been there, autochthonous. They hadn't come from anywhere else. And that was part of the justification for the two-parent citizenship. That Athenians had pure blood. That they were a democracy, which is a superior form of government. And that this had made them powerful, and that it was their duty as a superior nation to encourage or force other Greek cities to become democratic by war if necessary. So part of this exceptionalism does express itself in not only Greek versus barbarian, but Athenian versus other Greek. The most famous or notorious venue for political humor was, of course, theatrical comedy, known to us today through the 11 surviving plays of Aristophanes and thousands of fragments from lost comedies by Aristophanes and his rivals, other comic poets. Athenian comedy differed from today's political comedy, stand-up, theater, television, film, books, in being an institutionalized contest funded by wealthy Athenians through a special tax and produced and operated by the state. Comedy was truly people's theater, performed during a national holiday, devoted to theater, and before the largest audiences that gathered for any other public event during the year. Upwards of 10,000 spectators in a large amphitheater setting. The word comedy meant song of the komos, since theatrical comedy derived from komos, a traditional entertainment in which masked revelers passed through town wearing masks and costumes, much like the ones inherited by comic actors, and singing humorous or abusive songs about prominent citizens. Some vestiges of this still survive in rural Europe. In Switzerland, for instance, on special days, masked young men will go around and act a Festnacht, go to the mayor's house and sing some ugly lampoons about him. The identity is conventionally not known. This was also a regular practice in classical Athens. We might expect that comedy in a government-organized national theater would be rather like our public broadcasting system, fair to all and all in fun, but not so. Athenian comedy was even more outrageous than the politicians themselves, for example, by including plenty of sex and obscenity, and it was also just as partisan. The comic poets consistently took the side of the traditional landed gentry against urbanites and the well-to-do, against the poor. They attacked the excesses of full and direct popular sovereignty, and they were hostile to popular leaders, whom they called demagogues. Aristophanes may well have invented the term demagogue because we find it for the first time used in comedies he wrote against Cleon. Although there were occasional lawsuits by politicians, and now and then decrees of the People's Assembly limiting comic attack, we know of no successful lawsuits, and the decrees were short-lived. Apparently the people liked their political comedy strong, and indeed it appears to have been a privileged extension of their political debate. In our history courses, when we learn about Pericles, the first important democratic leader, we generally follow the sympathetic portrait drawn by Thucydides of a high-born, enlightened, selfless, and incorruptible statesman who led by superior intelligence and persuasiveness, who engineered the acquisition of a great empire, who personified an intellectual and cultural flowering that we still call the Periclean age, and who beautified his city through the building program that created monuments like the Parthenon, which still symbolize this golden age. But we get a different, that's certainly Pericles' opinion of himself, but we get a different picture from the comic poets, who saw Pericles as a dangerous democratic radical and attacked him as a Zeus-like king or tyrant, as a sexual predator and philanderer, as a squanderer of public funds, and as a warmonger. Pericles had a squill-shaped head that apparently ran in the family, and this was the main basis for his physical caricature. For example, in a play criticizing the building program as more for glorifying Pericles than Athens, the actor was shown wearing the odeon as a helmet. And there's the odeon of Pericles, a concert hall, and one comic poet just had him wearing that concert hall on his head to show who it was in the play. And of course there was sex. After his divorce, Pericles set up house with a freeborn citizen of Miletus named Aspasia, whom he could not marry because of the citizenship law that he himself had championed, but with whom he had a son. This was enough for the comic poets to build a portrait of Pericles as more sexually misbehaved than John Kennedy or Bill Clinton. Phidias, architect of the Parthenon, supposedly arranged trysts for Pericles with married women, and Leogoras, a friend who collected exotic birds, inspired a comedy portraying Pericles as Zeus disguised as a goose in a plot to seduce the goddess Nemesis. This myth then used figuratively for Pericles and Aspasia. Aspasia herself was caricatured as a courtesan who procured prostitutes for Pericles. Interestingly, in light of the Clinton scandal, Aristophanes claimed that these prostitutes were skilled in oral sex. So the first sex scandal in a democratic society is an oral sex scandal. She was also portrayed as wearing the pants in the family as Hera to his Zeus, and as his political advisor and trainer in oratory. For the comic poets, Pericles' advocacy of the war against Samos was simply to please Aspasia, whose hometown, Athens, was defended. The same motive was recycled when Pericles advocated for the Peloponnesian War. In the comic poet Cratinus' comedy Dionysus as Paris, Pericles appeared as Paris, winning Helen, i.e. Aspasia, from Aphrodite in the mythical beauty contest. It's interesting that if you read historians of Greece and you look under Aspasia, you will see all these slanders repeated as if they were true. All of them are from comedy. Pericles' successor, Cleon, the second great democratic leader in history, was a different sort of politician. Unlike Pericles, he did not come from a famous aristocratic family. He was a businessman who ran a tannery and I guess you could call a wholesale shoe store, presented himself as a populist, the self-styled watchdog of the people. Indeed, one of the people who could be counted on to keep an eye on elitists like the rich and the intellectuals, foreign sympathizers, anti-democrats, and anyone who wanted to go easier on the subject nations of the empire or to find a negotiated end to the Peloponnesian War against the Spartans. He also attacked men who submitted sexually to other men, or who could be accused of that. Aristophanes joked that he was simply afraid that these binoumenoi, these penetrated men, would become politicians and compete with him. Cleon was a godsend to humorists, since he had bushy eyebrows and a loud voice, was the first to wave his arms when speaking in the assembly, and was plain spoken, fond of using tradesman language. The comic poets had to find a new way to caricature this new kind of politician, and it was Aristophanes who created the winning formula. His play Knights of 424 BC was the first demagogue comedy. Its main character was Paphlagon, a foreign slave tanner who has taken over the house of Demos, i.e. the people, portrayed as a senile old man, by terrorizing the other slaves, i.e. politicians, and flattering Demos. But the terrorized slaves discover a secret oracle revealing that Paphlagon can be overthrown only by a politician even more vulgar, uneducated, and unprincipled, and in a business even more disgusting than tanning, namely a hot dog vendor. The rest of the play is an extended contest in pandering to the people by the tanner and his alter ego, the hot dog man. How it turns out, you'll have to discover by reading the play. Meanwhile, it's interesting that in a democracy, Aristophanes would caricature ordinary people. The demos in this play could be called the people, or Joe the plumber or something. That they would caricature the people this way, their audience, both as too vulgar to lead Athens themselves, and as dupes of popular leaders, too easily swayed by their bullying and boasting to see through them. Aristophanes is always castigating the audience for stupidity. How can you believe this guy? How can you believe what Cleon's telling you? It sounds snobbish and elitist, and to a degree it was, since the whole premise of democracy is the collective wisdom of the people. But to some extent, and in retrospect, this kind of snobbery was a natural response to a novel and scary situation for all Athenians. After all, these demagogues were the first non-aristocratic leaders in history, and were pioneering the populist line, of which no one knew the eventual outcome. The humorous caricature was not so much against ordinary people as it was against ordinary people who aspired to rise above their proper station by deceptive means, and against the ordinary people in the assembly who could not see through them, much as the character of Hitler the paper hanger, or Joe the plumber for that matter, is not meant to insult paper hangers or plumbers as such. But behind the humor is real anxiety about whether hot dog sellers are actually qualified to make policy recommendations, let alone lead the nation. In any event, demagogue comedy had a good run in Athens until the novelty wore off about 20 years later. And even Aristophanes would come to believe that his rivals were going too far, complaining, for instance, about one comedy that portrayed the mother of the popular politician Hyperbolus as an old whore dancing the hoochie coochie. One aspect of political humor as distinct from actual political positions is that it tends to become dated very rapidly, and soon requires footnotes pointing out what was so funny at the time. In the case of 2,500-year-old humor, it's often not easy to identify the point, especially in allegorical or symbolic jokes, as in the myth comedies of these characters that I noted earlier. We wouldn't see this unless ancient commentators had pointed out some of the signals toward the humor. Here's an example. I don't know if you can see this too well, but this is an interesting cup from Corinth, humorously depicting the story of Oedipus and the Sphinx, a riddle in myth. You'll remember that Oedipus, believing that he was foretold to kill his father and mother, left his city and left the parents that he thought were his father and mother to go as far away from them as possible. And on the way to Thebes, at a crossroads, he encounters a sphinx, that had been menacing the city. If you couldn't answer the Sphinx's question, then she would kill you. So Oedipus, a very smart man, managed to answer the question and defeat the Sphinx and make his way into Thebes, where he encountered, unbeknownst to anyone, his actual parents. Well, he didn't encounter his father because he kills his father on the way to Thebes, and then he marries his mother, and with unhappy outcome for everyone. But here's Oedipus and the Sphinx. Here's Oedipus confronting the monstrous Sphinx, who is besieging the city, answering her riddle. In this caricature, the Sphinx resembles a dog instead of the traditional lion, and has remarkable eyebrows. It looks as if the Sphinx is a caricature of Cleon, the beetle-browed, the self-styled people's watchdog. Aristophanes had in fact portrayed Cleon as a dog in his play Wasps. The Greek word for dog, kuon, makes a jingle with kleon. And as a bonus, it also sounded like leon, lion, a typical symbol of regal or tyrannical power. So this little joke, if this represents Cleon, as leon kuon, the lion dog, these are symbols that people could use to identify that, and all the associations that came with it. Not only the shameless barking of dogs, but also the terrifying prospect of the lion, symbol of tyrants. A further point of contact on the cup is the oracular nature of the Oedipus myth, also a feature of the plot of Knights, remember, when the slaves received the secret oracle, revealing that only a hot dog seller can overthrow the Paphlagon. So the oracular thing is appropriate for Cleon further, in that Cleon was fond of citing, comedians said manufacturing, oracles to support his proposal. Cleon apparently had a secret book of oracles that he would use to say, and the gods have given me an oracle supporting this. The odd abacus on top of the Ionic capital that the dog sphinx is sitting on suggests the speaker's platform in an assembly. And we may recall Aristophanes' joke that Cleon on the platform looked like a cormorant on a stone, ready to prey on Athenian allies. But who was Oedipus here supposed to represent? He's ordinary looking, perhaps Cleon's generic opposition, as in Knights, or perhaps he represents Athens itself, as may in some degree be true of the title character of Sophocles' Oedipus the King, performed shortly before this date. Perhaps he's a particular individual, no longer recognizable. One clue might be that this Oedipus holds a sword instead of the usual hunting spear or walking stick of the myth. Could he represent a general? Perhaps the Spartan general Brasidas, the great opponent of Cleon's imperialism and his ultimate conqueror. It's impossible to be sure, but in any event, this is surely a political cartoon, and it may well record opposition to Athenian imperialism under Cleon from outside Athens. Political humor was recognized in later antiquity, long after Athenian democracy had passed out of fashion, as a valuable hallmark of freedom. And it does turn out to be a hallmark that lives on in the Western literary tradition whenever democracy is found, though political humor would never again be as radical as it was in the correspondingly radical first stage of democracy. Of course, not everyone approved even then. Cleon twice sued Aristophanes, while moralists and philosophers frowned on any utterance that played fast and loose with the truth. Plato, for example, never forgave Aristophanes for his portrayal of Socrates in clouds, which Plato blamed for stirring the prejudice that eventually led to Socrates' execution in 399. So that Plato wanted to ban all political humor from his ideal republic, whether it was, quote, with or without animus. Plato's pupil, Aristotle, similarly considered political humor to be a form of violence and equated it with assault, murder, and robbery. But these voices were critical of democracy too, and for the same reasons. The voice of the people, like the voice of the humorist, can be dangerous to rulers, be they politicians or philosopher kings. Well, I hope this has been interesting, or at any rate reassuring, in that whatever the ludicrousness of our current political discourse, and however sore we may become when our guy is the butt of a good, nasty political joke, the world has seen it all before. Thanks. Are you all appalled, or do you have some questions, follow-up, comment? Yeah.
Yeah, I found this entertaining and educational. I think the political play persists. It's living and well today. If I recall correctly, there is a troubadour troupe that goes from city to city called Political Steps, Capital Steps, I think. Very humorous, very satirical, and pretty neutral, I think, just satirizing the prominent people in office.
Yeah, thank you for that. Yes, capital steps. But just imagine capital steps being put on before both houses of Congress, the Supreme Court, the heads of all the religions, and broadcast on public television, like the Super Bowl, for instance, and funded by the wealthiest Americans who were forced by the special tax, again by law, to fund it. And then to hear something like this vicious attack on the leading politician of the day from a very partisan angle. Kind of funny that the people would allow this to go on, you know. And I guess it's a mirror of the actual political discourse.
You made a comment earlier. You made a comment earlier in your talk that one of the functions of political humor is a community BS detector, and yet we have a tremendous amount of gross exaggeration and outright dishonesty on the part of the humorist as well as the politician. Can you comment on that a little bit?
Yeah, well, as I say, it's a delicate line sometimes between partisan humor and humor that everybody could get behind. One politician's bending of the facts is another one's obvious conclusion to be drawn, or the essence of the problem. So, again, humor is kind of open-ended in that you never know what it's going to do when it gets out there, whether it's going to be successful, and how literally to take it. Because the humorist has to build in a humorous mechanism. I think the Obama New Yorker cover didn't do that. There weren't clues as to what the humor was supposed to be. You had to supply the clues rather than the satirist. So people could say, well, that's dishonest. They're not Muslims. So you say it's not factual. And then the cartoonist said, no, of course it's not factual. That's the point. I was making fun of it being not factual. But people couldn't tell. And I think that there's a kind of spectrum of political statement, political fact, political quantum that you can include in the humor. And it's hard to judge sometimes whether you should laugh or not, or whether the premise is right. Yeah.
Don't you think the New Yorker cover it was playing to a particular audience, and the people that are reading the New Yorker, that get in the New Yorker, are sort of more in tune with that kind of humor than people that might not be getting the New Yorker. So I think, I liked it. I thought it worked well, given where I was coming from and giving those people coming. So I didn't see that it failed as humor.
Well, maybe 15 years ago, when only New Yorker readers would have seen it. But now, it goes viral and global in minutes. So people that never read the New Yorker will see it. And So it's sort of uncontrolled if you take it out of context. Danish cartoonists that caricatured the prophet, have to go into hiding now, because there's a fatwa against them. The people that think that the prophet should not be represented at all think this is a deadly crime to do that. So again, if they hadn't seen it, they wouldn't have reacted, but nowadays they do see things like that.
It seems that you had to go all the way back to ancient Greece in order to give us examples of political humor through the ages. And it seems to me that political humor didn't seem to re-emerge until new democracies came into existence. So I would expect that if, democratic governments would necessarily be the home of founding political humor, because you didn't give us any examples in the Roman Empire or through the Middle Ages, where everything was run by kings. There was no democracy until the United States came into existence, except possibly for Switzerland.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, thank you for that. That's good. There does tend to be a strong correlation. The Romans did have political humor, but not about politicians of right now, about past politicians. So when you read Juvenal's satires, they're scathing condemnations of Nero and Domitian, but Nero and Domitian are dead. There aren't any condemnations at all of the current emperor. In Shakespeare, there are fools who tell the king the truth. They have fool's privilege, and they're very funny. But that's not exactly political. Certainly the courtiers of the king are not engaging in, there's no place for participants to ridicule. In 18th century Britain was a very rich time with Thomas Gilray. And so I think you find the full-blooded one coming forward in England later. But Germany, too, has a tradition of off and on. But you're right, by and large, it's a democratic phenomenon, or at least a parliamentary society phenomenon.
I was going to mention the late 18th century, those political cartoons that were so wonderful, they were actually bought by subscription. So people would pay a subscription, and then on a regular basis, they would get these political cartoons about various leaders and the left and the right and that sort of thing. One of the things I find remarkable today is that so many people get what they think is their news from a comedy source, from a satire source, and that is Jon Stewart, of course. There's probably one of our premier, I don't know whether you call him a comedian or a satirist or both, but clearly a lot of people think they get their news from there.
Yeah, and I think a case could be made for Glenn Beck as a satirist and humorist.
You wouldn't think so.
Well, and I think Jon Stewart would consider himself a newsman, a journalist, someone that's engaged. The definition right now seems to be how much do you know about the current event, and how are you framing this for people? Anyway, yeah, good, thank you. A little nervous to see some political scientists here in the room. Judy Swanson back there. Anyway, I'm sorry.
I'm not in such exalted persuasions, but one of the problems I see with political humor is that, going back to the Whigs, they portray themselves as a common man, but actually they're elitist and drives. They try to eliminate hard cider. And do you think that's a problem of humor, just distills complex issues down into what people can laugh at and enjoy, but it can be too easy, it's too easy to manipulate people.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's a very good point. Humor is manipulative in the sense that you're setting people up in a certain posture with certain professional techniques to agree with you about something. Yeah, I mean, if you can make a good joke, then that does a lot of work for you. that maybe a PowerPoint presentation wouldn't quite do as efficiently.
Like Reagan would give the age when we all was some concern of senility. He would rock them on there, well, I won't use your youth and inexperience against you.
Yeah,
It
exactly.
avoided the whole issue, and, you know, kind of history would be the judge.
Yeah, or in that famous moment in the debate where it says, "There you go again," you know, and people would fill in, "Yes, we've heard this." And President Reagan heard it, he understands, let's move on. You know, beautiful way of avoiding, at the other person's expense, you know, a difficult question. So yes, you're quite right. Simplify, contour, appeal to an area where you know people are, there's a humor zone there. And you're not always successful, but very good humorists usually know how to work that. Yeah. So you're right, it's sort of a political technique in itself.
They had no printing presses, but how would they communicate to draw a crowd? You know, was it word of mouth or tablets or?
Well, it was a regular yearly festival, and as I say, it was the largest gathering of the year. And so people would want to come. And as for circulation in advance, there was announcements that were made a week in advance of what the plays were going to be and who the actors were. And there were big prizes given for victory, so people were interested to see who was going to win these contests of plays, tragedies too. And then if you wanted a copy of the play for yourself, or you wanted songs from it that you could sing at your symposium, you could have them copied out. There were no printing presses, but there was hand copying of books, scrolls, which is where we ultimately get these plays from those copies. When Aristophanes wrote a funny song about Cleon, he always wrote it in his popular style so that people would take it away from the theater and sing it out there, you know, further damaging Cleon. These are very embarrassing songs, you know, dwelling on, you know, that Cleon was expelled from his music school and that he was cheated when he was in school and all these, you know, and he stole things. And so he put these in nice little ditties, and then people would just sing them.
I want to thank you very much for this wonderful.
Thank you all.
In a second, I'll invite you out there to think about your favorite political jokes and tell them to each other. I want to thank you all for coming out here and participating in this and for staying active with Boston University. I would be remiss if I didn't say we invite your participation at many events and we invite your support. Events like this occur because of people's generosity and their support. Indeed, Jeff is here because of generosity and support. He holds an endowed chair that allows him to be able to do the kind of work that leads him to be able to see things that we wouldn't be able to see without his work. So, large or small, now or later, I invite you to support us and to join us in many ways.